delighted to welcome you all here this morning for another of our CGPP online research sessions. Today we have presenting for us Anna Grzymala-Busse, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. Anna's research interests include political parties, state development and transformation, informed political institutions, religion and politics, and post-communist politics. Anna has published several books, including Nations Under God, How Churches Use Moral Authority to Influence Policy, which is published with Princeton University Press, and also Rebuilding Leviathan, Party Competition, State Exploitation in Post-Communist Democracies, which was published with Cambridge University Press. She's published numerous articles in leading journals like World Politics and Party Politics, and also I was just looking through Anna's CV yesterday. There's 5 articles in comparative political studies. There should be some kind of prize for that. Given that that's the journal I've had most desk rejections from, I was particularly galled, but also in admiration to see that. Most recently in comparative political studies, Anna's had the article, The Consequences of Authoritarian Party Exit and Reinvention for Democratic Competition. So today Anna will be talking to us for about, I think, 30 minutes, Anna, 35 minutes. And then, as usual, we'll have Q&A for about 20-25 minutes after that. Okay, so no further ado, over to you, Anna.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation. This is probably as close as I'll get to Australia for the foreseeable future. So, greetings from a fiery and smoky California. Now, what I'm going to present today is a brand new project, and it's basically, as the title would suggest, taking Charles Tilly to church and looking at the medieval and religious roots of the state. This is, in fact, sort of the first paper to come out of this project, so please bear with me. It's still relatively drafty. Oh, hold on. Okay. So what I'd like to say today, I'll basically make 3 separate points, or 3 distinct points. The first of this is to revise the canonical perspective on state building, which focuses on the early modern era and on the ways in which conflict built the state during that time. Secondly, I'll argue that the medieval and religious roots of the state are different, and the Catholic Church basically becomes the powerful rivet and template. That's the relevant player in the medieval era, not other state conflict, but the church itself. So the canonical accounts of state formation basically focus on war and contracts. And so we have the bellicists, who basically focus on war and external rivalry. This is Charles Tilly's famous dictum that the war makes the state and the state makes war. The idea here is that as states engage in armed conflict, they need bigger armies, they need to build up more institutions of extraction, they build up this taxation and other institutions willy-nilly, and they basically consolidate out of this highly fragmented territorial scene of the early 1900s and basically become the states we know today. They're also contractarians, people like Doug North and Barry Weingass, Tom Ertmans, The Savage, and others, who basically focus on parliaments, on negotiations, and on the internal contracts between groups of elites. So this is also a story that has something to do with war, but here the state arises as a form of constraints placed on the monarch by elites who don't want to be expropriated. And the story that follows is basically once you have these parliaments, you get other institutions, and again, the state is being built, this time through contracts. Both of these accounts focus on the early modern period, from about 1550 to 750 or 1800. They take the territorial fragmentation of Europe as a starting point. And the basic argument here is that interstate conflict, secular ruler conflict, is what necessitates taxation. Subsequent state institutions are either epiphenomenal, as in the bellicist account, or the result of these explicit contracts between elites. Great. So what I want to do basically is to present a revisionist account of state formation. And that basically necessitates making a move more into the distant past, into the period of basically the high Middle Ages from the 11th through the 14th century. And what I'll argue is that here, the territorial fragmentation that the bellicists take as an exogenous, as a given as as the status quo from which they built their account, was in fact a deliberate choice of the Catholic Church. I'll also argue that medieval war does not have the same state building effects that early modern war does. And rather than state institutions being the result of either sort of random processes or deliberate contracts, I'm going to argue that state institutions co-evolve with ecclesiastical templates, with basically what the church is doing and the resources that the church can provide. In fact, what I'm doing basically is doing the unexpected and bringing the church back into the study of the state. Now, why do we want to take a look at the medieval church? If we move back this sort of period of analysis to the Middle Ages, the church becomes the key source of and constraint on state power. It is the key rival. You basically have popes, as I'll argue, arguing over sovereignty and authority, over who gets to govern where and with what resources, almost everywhere in Europe. It is a powerful template because it has the material and human capital that serves then as a source of templates for the would-be nascent states. But above all, it can do so because it's an extremely powerful organization. The state has the wealth, the church has the wealth. In the medieval era, it owns up to 40% of land in any given territory. It has the organization. After the 11th century, the church becomes very centralized, with popes basically sending out not only bishops to do their job, but making sure that they're collecting information, collecting taxes, and basically acting as a relatively well-functioning hierarchy. It also has human capital. It is basically the one source of literate clerks and literate experts. And it also wields powerful spiritual weapons. Those are something that we don't really think about these days. You have the examples of the fatwa in Muslim societies. But in the Middle Ages, excommunications and interdicts were powerful spiritual weapons. And you can see here that basically the time when they're most used also coincides with sort of roughly the era of the greatest church power from the 10th to the 14th century. And these are explicitly political excommunications. So the record winner here was Henry IV, who was excommunicated 5 different times by 3 different popes. Now, so what does this look like? I'll talk in turn about a church as the rival, the church as a template, and the church as a set of resources. So first, what is the church as a rival? We're here basically in the Middle Ages. What you see are a whole bunch of struggles over authority between monarchs on the one hand and the papacy on the other. These take the form of territorial struggles, where the church explicitly acts to form different alliances and to sort of build alliances with different monarchs in ways that fragment territory, and specifically in ways that fragment the Holy Roman Empire, or what we know now as Germany. They do so basically because the Holy Roman Emperor is the single biggest sort of threat to their authority. We also see this in the investiture crisis, which I'll talk about, which leads to differentiation of church and state. And it leads to a struggle over sovereignty in the late 13th century, over who gets to monopolize rule within a given territory. So first, fragmentation. So in the existing account, fragmentation is exogenous. If you read Tilly, Sprout, others, they take it for granted that Europe is fragmented, and from this sort of highly sort of pixelated soil, you build the new states. What I'm going to argue is that instead it's a deliberate church policy. The biggest rival the popes faced was the Holy Roman Empire. And they did so because of a sort of a mutual system of legitimation, where popes would basically name emperors and the emperors would name the popes. And this kind of mutual legitimation and mutual conferring of authority led to enormous struggles. And it also led the Holy Roman emperors to continually come down into Italy and threaten the Pope. And so as a result, what the popes do is basically try to balance against the Holy Roman Empire, and to a lower extent against the Holy Roman, the German properties in Italy. And as a result of this, the problem is I can't move my slides now. Okay, hold on. There we go.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Perfect.
The problem then becomes that basically, as a result of these deliberate policies, the Holy Roman Empire, the sort of German territories, become the most highly fragmented territories in Europe. This is basically a slide that shows you roughly where let me just make it a bit smaller. So basically the broken line above is the territorial fragmentation of what was the Holy Roman Empire in its 1800 boundaries. You can see that it's incredibly fragmented. It contains more tiny principalities and states than any other area. The green line is Italy, And the lines below are Spain, France, and England, which obviously basically have no fragmentation and very quickly to become just a singular state. And what's interesting about this is that the fragmentation that was supposed to be resolved by the early modern era, in fact, isn't in the areas where the church didn't want it to be resolved and where it kind of set into motion these incredibly fragmenting policies. And so you can see that this fragmentation persists. It really goes up until basically 1300, which is the sort of the peak of church power. And then it's maintained. These principalities develop their own interest. They balance against the emperor. And you have all kinds of local bishops and local lords who basically insist on holding on to power and prevent a centralization of Germany as we know it. So this account that the classicists would have us, or the bellicists would have of basically fragmentation that's overcome by state conflict is belied by what's happening in areas where the church deliberately wants to foment it. Secondly, we have the investiture controversy. This is basically a way in which the church rivalry with the nascent states led to the very separation of church and state. This is basically a controversy nominally over who gets to name the bishops. In fact, it's over where the boundaries between the two lie. It lasts close to 50 years. Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV are the two main protagonists, and it eventually gets concluded by the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which resolves this particular conflict only insofar as it basically says there are these two separate entities. There's the church and the state. They'll continue to struggle over power, but for the first time, they're seen as distinct by international actors. This, of course, is is an image of Henry IV, who basically apocryphally, in order to, after being excommunicated by Gregory VII, in order to regain his empire and to regain his standing in the church, stood barefoot at Canossa, a castle in Italy, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, knowing full well that because he was showing sincere penance, the Pope had no choice but to basically lift the excommunication and bring him back in. The story may be apocryphal, but nonetheless, it's a sort of, powerful illustration of the ways in which these spiritual weapons meant a great deal. Now, the investiture conflict differentiated the church from the state, but the conflict continued. And it continued because it wasn't yet clear who assumed supremacy, basically. Where basically did sovereignty lie? And to what extent could kings treat the clergy within their territories as any other citizen? So the struggle over sovereignty is also another example of the rivalry between the church and the state. And it's exemplified by Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII, the Pope at the time. And basically the conflict was over taxation. Philip wanted to tax the clergy, Boniface forbade him from doing so. And the big question was, does the monarch rule over all, including the papal subjects? The Pope insisted that the Pope has supreme sovereignty and authority, but the resolution was largely in favor of the king, mostly because his deputies came, kidnapped Boniface, and within a year, basically, he died a broken man. And again, the point here is that this rivalry was not between states, it was between the church and the state. And this time it established the principle that it's the kings who get to decide what happens within their territory, not the Pope. So even if you're clergy, even if even if you're somehow the people apart, the king can nonetheless rule over you, extract taxes, and so on. But this wasn't just about rivalry. The church also functioned as an important resource of both material and human capital. There's a familiar story told by my colleague Lisa Blades and her co-authors about the Crusades, and the ways in which the Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, really led to the beginning of formalized tax extraction by both the state and the church, initially on behalf of church fundraising for the Crusades. The church was also an incredibly powerful source of expertise and personnel. It had literate clerks in both monasteries and later at the universities. And these were sort of eagerly, basically taken up by the courts, by the royal courts, in order to serve as legal experts, as clerks, as scribes, and so on. Bishops served as judges almost everywhere. And many of these people basically became sort of high-ranking both church officials and state officials. There's a reason why the chancellor and the exchequer basically are still cardinals as late as the time of Henry VIII. Because in England, for example, because this is basically, these are the people who have the most expertise and who are the best schooled. And the two sources of this capital, of course, monasteries and universities. Here's an image of an early 14th century university. And if you look at the guy in blue kneeling over, that it's pretty much where most of our students are doing distance learning these days. Now, the church also functioned as a template. It came up with all kinds of legal and administrative solutions relatively early on, and many of these were then adopted. And so you have this process of mutual coevolution, where the church borrows basically from the monasteries and from royal courts some solutions, develops them, and then they get adopted by other royal courts. You also have canon law that, along with Roman law, their rediscovery in the 11th, 12th centuries, serving as the basic for civic law across Europe. The state administration, as has been demonstrated by several authors, basically, and the division of labor within this administration, the chancery, the finances, the judiciary, the sort of classic tripartite division of labor within most courts that we see, is taken directly from the papal court of the 12th century. And here, the bishops, the sort of, the nominal subject of the investiture controversy, are critical. They're critical because they serve as the judges. They're basically lay judges and lay judges for kings, and then subsequently administer both ecclesiastic and secular law. In fact, there are all kinds of amazing accounts of people who basically jurisdiction shop, and they decide that it's actually better to go with the bishops than with the local lay judge, because the bishops provide a better deal for their particular complaint. The bishops also serve as lords here. They administer vast swathes of territory, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. They basically become not just the spiritual emissaries of the Pope, but basically sort of local governors. And they serve as administrators. They are the ones who basically collect local taxes. They are the ones who are responsible in many cases for local infrastructure. And in many cases, they also sort of keep records of what's going on in their particular diocese. And so what you see here, and I'm sorry that this is so small, it's basically a timeline of when different state institutions arise. And if you could sort of, this is basically all this, various states of Europe, ranging from Poland to England, Spain, Italy, and so on, Sweden. And I think so, the important thing here is we can just extract when the church comes up with these institutions, which is much, much earlier than most states. And if you compare that to what happens in the Holy Roman Empire, where the fragmentation of the territorial administration and the sort of active church efforts basically mean that it's not until the late 15th century that the Holy Roman Empire develops a central tax administration, a census, courts, and a treasury. And even those aren't particularly centralized, and taxation basically falls off shortly afterwards. So what we see here on one hand is a church that sort of develops a lot of these institutions early on and prevents the development of these institutions through fragmentation in places like the Holy Roman Empire. Now, that of course sort of, leads us to ask, so, if these are sort of some of the mechanisms, what are the broader patterns? And what I've argued here so far is that the role of the church in the medieval period should be different. So we should see differences between the heyday of sort of, the medieval church versus a later period, the early modern period that's been sort of the target of and the focus of Bellicist analysis. And we can ask here whether war builds states, and to what extent does emulation build states? And to do that, I collected a new data set, I'm still cleaning it up, on basically various institutions and various localities. It's all geocoded in Europe from 900 to 1900. It builds on existing data sets on cities, conflict, and institutions, but we're expanding this data set to include Eastern Europe, which these data sets ignore, as well as Spain, and systematically looking at Spain, France, and England, which again isn't often taken up by these data sets. We have a whole bunch of measures, a whole bunch of controls, everything from soil quality to river proximity, roughness of terrain, and so on. And we have, this allows us basically to differentiate also between secular conflict on the one hand and papal conflict on the other. And what we have here basically is with this data, using both existing data sources and ones that we've collected, allows us to basically differentiate between secular conflict and papal conflict, along with new data that I've collected on excommunications, monasteries, bishoprics, courts, and so on. Now, as the two dependent variables for the subsequent analysis, I'm looking at cities and at parliaments as two proxies, two very different proxies for state formation. Cities are associated, or urbanization, the growth of cities, is associated with economic development, trade, contract enforcement, and nascent political rights. And so it's a powerful sort of proxy for a particular path of state development. Parliaments are also important as the increasingly formalized institutions of consultation and consent. We can't talk in this time about representation or self-governance. Those don't exist. And in fact, by the early modern era, many of these parliaments have basically been totally sort of attenuated because this is also the era of absolutism. So a lot of these parliaments aren't particularly functioning. But it would still, nonetheless, we can still see whether they exist and to what extent these factors play into their existence. So first, these are the results for urbanization. And the first thing to note here is that secular conflict has a big impact on state development, but only in the early modern era. In the medieval period, we basically have a much more diffuse impact of the church, of secular conflict on state development. Papal conflict, on the other hand, undermines urbanization in the medieval period, largely because this conflict isn't exactly designed to build up cities. If your leader is excommunicated and can't lead, that makes it difficult to build up a state. It has a very small positive impact in the early modern era. Bishops, as the sort of representatives, as lords, as administrators, have a powerful impact on, or at least a powerful correlation with the growth of cities, and to a smaller extent, sort of crusades and monasteries. And this is, by the way, controlling for all the sort of the trade proximity, rough terrain, et cetera, variables that we usually see deployed. We see a slightly different pattern with parliaments, where again, we see a difference, especially when it comes to conflict between the early modern and the medieval period. So secular conflict has is positively correlated to parliaments in the medieval period, but it's negatively correlated in the early modern era. Largely, I would assume, because by this point, these are, if you are engaging in conflict in the early modern era, you're a powerful monarch and you basically try to squelch the parliament as much as possible. Papal conflict, for its part, has a highly positive impact in the medieval era, but not so much in the early modern, where the church power is much lower. Bishops here play a negative role, and that makes total sense when we realize that they are the lords of these cities and of these territories, right? And so they are basically a rival to parliamentary power. There are all kinds of accounts of how bishops fought the rise of any kind of local assemblies because they would threaten their hold on power. And again, crusades and monasteries have a modest positive correlation. So the irony, though, that emerges from all this, from all these patterns, is that there's one unintended consequence of all the sort of building up of the state, of the fact that the conflict leads to greater urbanization, more parliaments, of the fact that these royal administrations are emulating the church and drawing on its resources. Because as the resources migrate to the state, it grows much more powerful. The church basically is increasingly on the back foot. It increasingly has to sort of, defend itself with legal arguments rather than with anything else. It is unable to sort of mount these extensive challenges that we see in the earlier era. And as a result, already by the 15th century, the church is relatively impoverished. It's basically relying on selling offices in order to survive. And that makes it vulnerable to the threat of reformation. Because increasingly more and more people are getting sick and tired of sort of this church behavior on the one hand, and have the capacity to challenge it in ways that they could not have in the medieval period. So in conclusion, what I'm arguing here in this project so far is that medieval state formation is not the same as early modern state formation. If we want to sort of truly understand how the state formed, it's not enough to just take a look at the early modern state. We also, I think, need to expand our analytical focus to an earlier era when difference of mechanisms and different actors played a role. Different mechanisms here, of course, mean not just conflict, but also emulation and the use of church resources. And if we incorporate the church, what we stand to gain is a deeper understanding of why it is that Europe was so fragmented by the time that the early modern conflict began. We stand to get a deeper understanding of the notions of sovereignty and the fact that they arose not with the Treaty of Westphalia or Augsburg in the 17th and 16th centuries respectively, but in a much earlier period, something like 3 centuries earlier, with this conflict between the popes and the kings, basically at the end of the 14th century. And we also stand to gain a new understanding of why we have the institutions of the state that we do. That these aren't simply sort of, epiphenomenal or there's a miraculous result of these contracts, but instead they're basically adaptations and coevolutions with church institutions, sort of ready-made templates that were there to be basically used and adapted. And we also begin to understand why it is that by the early modern period, we do see interstate conflict as sort of, the main driver of state formation. Because by that point, the church, instead of handing over all these resources, had in effect basically given the states the ability to both fight with each other and to ignore the church itself. And so with that, I'll conclude the presentation, and I very much look forward to your questions.